That's what I do
was
for my
fine.
class right now.
Yeah.
Is it's all. I mean, if somebody wants to bring in their own camera.
Good morning. I'm Terry Williams, president of the Keene Sentinel, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to Radically Rural's community journalism track. Our schedule for the next 2 days is to present experts in the areas of trusting news and philanthropic support for journalism, and to offer again our annual Crazy Good session on the best ideas and tools for journalists. When Radically Rural was started in 2018, the goal was to bring together people who have something important to say about sustainable small communities. In my opinion, no community can be truly successful without a strong local news organization holding government and businesses to account, lifting up those who need support, and showcasing excellence in achievement. Sadly, our profession and purpose, particularly in low-populated areas and among underserved populations in this country, are under threat, either by disruptive changes that confront our revenue models or by a lack of trust in what we do. Radically Rural's goal is to present to you ideas to meet those challenges and place stronger footing under what we believe are the most important aspects of the work that you do. We're going to present hopefully some best practices, and just as important, a great network of people to whom you can turn for help and for meaningful ideas. That is the core of Radically Rural, the sharing of ideas and the creation of networks toward our sustainability. Before we begin our first session this morning, I want to make a couple of acknowledgments. First, my thanks to the Knight Foundation, which through a generous sponsorship has underwritten the attendance both online and in person of many rural and student journalists here today. I had distinct pleasure spending time yesterday with 3 journalists from New Mexico and another from Missouri, and I came away from that time thinking we're going to be in good hands. The Knight Foundation has been a strong supporter of Radically Rural, and we thank the organization for its leadership. I also want to thank Tom Ewing, publisher of the Keene Sentinel, for his support of our time that we invest into this event, and to the staff at the Sentinel for their willingness to lend hands. At this point, I'd like to introduce to you Kristen Nevius, director of the Marlin Fitzwater Center for Communication at Franklin Pierce University. The center is the gracious sponsor of the community journalism track again this year, and student journalists from Franklin Pierce once more are providing news coverage for Radically Rural, and they will help with the production of a 16-page special section that will be printed and inserted tomorrow in the Sentinel and also distributed to all attendees. So, Dr. Nevius.
Thank you, Terry. It is indeed exciting to be able to support Radically Rural and the community journalism track yet again. The president of Franklin Pierce University, Dr. Kim Mooney, felt the support was very fitting as the Marlin Fitzwater Center is preparing to celebrate its 20th anniversary and the university its 60th anniversary. One of the reasons we have thrived over the past decades and through the pandemic is that the region has embraced us, our students, and our mission. The generosity of the state journalism ecosystem has been simply astounding, and they've shared opportunities and expertise with young journalists, and we are happy to be able to thank you in this manner. We're also especially proud to be part of the Granite State News Collaborative, which under the executive director, Melanie Plenda, has emerged from the pandemic as one of the nation's top news collaboratives. As the pandemic kicked in with a jolt in early March 2020, the state's outlets just organically turned to each other to coordinate the coverage that the Granite Staters needed. Hundreds of stories emerged from these newsrooms, and my faith in local journalism grew with every word. It has been an astounding thing to watch. And so we look forward to this edition of Radically Rural. And thank you.
And so finally, before I bring in our first session speakers, just a couple of housekeeping items. We'll be going straight through this next hour and 40 minutes or so. So feel free to get up and use the restrooms if you need to, which are through the lobby to the left, and also help yourself to the coffee. Our format for you in person and people online does require a little juggling, and so please be patient as we shift back and forth between our online speakers and those who are here. Blessed are those people who are in tech, because if this were left to me, this would be a real trouble. I'm next pleased to introduce Joy Mayer, founder and director of Trusting News, a project that examines perceptions of news and trains journalists in transparency and engagement strategies. That work follows a 20-year career in newsrooms and teaching. She is an adjunct faculty member at the Poynter Institute and also spent 12 years teaching at the Missouri School of Journalism, where she created an engagement curriculum and a community outreach team in the newsroom of the Columbia Missourian, and also taught web and print design. Joy will introduce her panelists and will lead us in a discussion about how rebuilding or strengthening trust in our organizations is so vital to our future. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I so wish I were there with you in person. I'm joining today from Sarasota, Florida, where it is not the loveliest time of year. So I'm super envious of you guys getting together in New England. I'm happy to kick us off today and to let you get to know the really smart folks with me. I have a background in newspaper journalism. As Terry said, I worked at a couple of newspapers in Florida and in Kansas, and then taught at the Missouri School of Journalism. And this work on trust really emerged for me from being on the front lines of feedback that my teaching newsroom in Columbia, Missouri was getting from the community we serve. So mid-sized town in the middle of Missouri, hearing so much from folks that some people were very engaged with us and had plenty to say, were invested in our work, had plenty to say about our work. And other folks, it just became very clear, had so many assumptions about what community journalism was there to do, who we were as journalists, what our goals were, our presumed lack of ethics and integrity. And I just realized that unless we told a better story about who we were and what we were there to do, we were just missing a huge chunk of the community that we were there to serve. We see ourselves as a public service. So many journalists do, especially local journalists. And I just decided that what I really wanted to do was learn more about the nature of trust and what it is, and how journalists can demonstrate that they're worthy of the trust. What does it look like for journalists to build that ethic of earning trust into their day-to-day work? So that's my background. That's what we're here to talk about today. And I'm thrilled to next introduce you to a journalist who I have just gotten acquainted with in the last few months, but whose work is completely inspiring. Crystal Good is doing the hard work of building trust and creating journalism for rural communities, for communities of color. And I am thrilled to kick it off to Crystal so she can tell you what she's bringing with her to the conversation today.
Thanks, Joy. Hello, everybody. I can't see you, but I'm guessing you can see me in this magical world of technology. My name is Crystal Good. I am a 6th generation West Virginian. My granddaddy told me I was West Virginia before West Virginia was West Virginia, and that's the truth. I also can, as far back as I can trace my lineage, I am Appalachian. So hopefully everyone that's listening, we don't have to define the Appalachian region. You guys know, because you're radically rural and you know that the majority of Appalachia is rural, and that's where I come from. And I'm really, really excited to talk with you all about Black by God today, which is the publication that I am publishing and finding and working to build trust with audiences, but mostly building trust within myself as a person within, the conditions of Appalachia and the landscape of news and media, that I can do this and that this is needed. So we'll talk a lot about that, but I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. As you know, I'm West Virginian, and if you don't know, that's West Virginia right there. So that's what that is behind my head there. But a lot of people know me as a poet as an artist. So listen, if you're into environmental poetry, mountaintop removal, the political conditions of West Virginia, you can find my work out there on the internet. But I share that because that's what I'm bringing to the table. I'm bringing a very non-traditional journalism background that is based in storytelling through poetry, through performance art, and through listening to the people. So for many years, I recognized that I would take stories from West Virginia, whether that's the story of a mine disaster and interpreting it through the lens of what does that coal miner's wife feel like. I have a poem called Black Diamonds. And what I realized that what I was doing is taking news stories and making them something very familiar, like what the griot of a community would do, taking it and putting it into language so that people could remember. And so now I'm excited to see how that translates into what I'm building with Black by God. And I'm learning so much, but you know, the key, I think for me and for those of you out there that are, you know, on this sort of independent journalism journey, is not only is the trust that I have in myself is only because of the trust that I have from the community. And every day someone sends me a message of keep going, or they send me a story, which is pretty amazing. So I'm excited to talk about that, and I will pass. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Huapi. I am the Director of Multimedia at The Day in New London, Connecticut. We are a approximately 20,000 circulation daily newspaper located in a city of about 30,000, covering a county of about 300,000. And so my journalism work at The Day is video reporting and audio reporting. And I've been our newsroom's liaison to Trusting News for the last 3 or 4 years, I think ever since I met Joy during my graduate work at Missouri. And my reason for wanting to get involved, I think, was very similar to Joy's. She talked about being on the front lines of feedback. As a photojournalist at a newspaper, I was often the one out in the community seeing the most local faces and hearing their complaints. Sometimes praise, but often complaints. I remember specifically having to cover a rally for a U.S. Senate candidate on the day that our newspaper endorsed his opponent, and getting a lot of grief, and not necessarily good-natured grief, from the people there. And that sort of put a bug in me that maybe we are not doing the best job explaining what we do and building better relationships with the people in our community. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the work that we've done at The Day in New London.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. My name is Lynn Walsh. I'm the Assistant Director of Trusting News. I've been working with Joy for, I think it's been almost 4 years now. And time flies when you're having fun, as they say, and it is fun work. It's also really hard work. My background prior to joining Trusting News is primarily in local television. I worked primarily as an investigative reporter, producer, or news manager in TV stations in Houston, Florida, Ohio, and in California. I'm currently based in San Diego, California, where I also am an adjunct professor. For me, why I wanted to work with Trusting News, and actually why I left the newsroom, which was a hard decision because you miss that breaking news, kind of all of that happens in a newsroom. But I was working with the Society of Professional Journalists, and I was talking to a lot of members of the public, non-journalist, and I realized there's a lack of understanding of how we do our jobs. And a lot of that lack of understanding turns into these negative misassumptions or these accusations. And I realized when you have these conversations and explain how it works, we were then able to talk about the content. And so I found what Joy was doing, and she was doing exactly this. So I was like, I want to do this now kind of full time more. And so that's what brought me to Trusting News. So we're very glad to be here with you today. We are, the four of us, going to talk about how to build trust with these different communities. We're going to give you a little bit of research. But some of the things we're really here to talk about is, you know, when you think about trust and you think about people who you trust, they're probably people you know. They're probably people you have relationships with. You've probably met, or at least you've had enough conversations, even if it's online, that you feel that you have that relationship. And so what we want to talk about today is, one, how can we make the most as journalists of those existing relationships that we currently have? How can we build that loyalty with people that we currently have relationships with? Maybe that means how can we increase paid subscriptions, get more followers, get more money in the door, right, to pay for our work? How can we let supporters know that we value them, that we want to continue to hear from them, or that we want to hear from them if we're not already? And then how can we better involve those supporters, those people we're already connected to, into our reporting process? Ask them how we're doing, how we could be better. So those are the people we want to continue relationships with that we already have. They might be people that already trust us or that we're already connected to. But then we also want to talk about all of those people that we may not have connections with. Who are we not currently building relationships or coming in contact with? One, how can we reach those people? How can we grow that audience? Who are those people in our communities, right? It's going to look different depending on where you are based and what your newsroom currently is doing. But how can we reach those people, be relevant to them with our news coverage, and hopefully build trust with them? Maybe an ideal situation is they already have a little bit of trust in you and you can kind of build on that. But if there isn't trust, how can we repair that relationship so that they do start to trust us? And then how can we get feedback from them? How are we reaching them, getting that feedback? How is that feedback influencing our news coverage to make it better? That's one point that I want to say before I toss it to Joy, who's going to talk about kind of a little bit of the Trusting News process. We're here at Trusting News to make journalism better and to do journalism a little bit differently than we have in the past. And we're not saying that the things that we're doing currently are wrong. We're not trying to attack what's being done. The goal is how can we be better? And if our communities are being critical of our coverage, instead of maybe ignoring that, how can we look at that as an opportunity of improvement? And is there something that we maybe are missing that could be better? So that's kind of the lens that I hope that you take some of this points and this data. And then Joy, I'm going to toss it over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. So I'm going to talk through just a little bit about what we do at Trusting News and how we think about trust and our journalists' ability to earn trust. We have since 2016 partnered with newsrooms willing to invest in the work sort of on behalf of the rest of the industry. People like Peter, who we've been working with for a while now. And I'm just so grateful that people like Peter continue to make time for this, because Lynn and I have newsroom backgrounds and can think of what we really come up with pretty decent hypotheses about what we think will work for newsrooms to build trust with audiences, but then we rely on journalists to go test those ideas out and see how they actually function and how audiences respond. So a little bit of quick research to kick us off. It's no surprise to anyone here, I'm sure, that just how dramatically trust in news has been declining, especially if you take the long view and back up. The Gallup has been asking the question of how much trust do people have in mass media since the late 70s. It peaked a few years after Watergate. They then didn't ask the question for a while. But then you can see when they started asking again, it's been dipping slowly ever since. It's not just a problem of the internet, and it's not just a problem of the Trump era. Trust has been dipped through the rise of talk radio, the rise of cable news. Overall, it's been up and down, but not too dramatically shifting the last few years. Where you see the really dramatic shift is when you break it down by partisanship. That trust by people who lean blue has been actually increasing the last several years, people who are sort of doubling down on the need for responsible journalism. But the latest number of people who lean right shows that only 10% of people who identify as conservative say they have at least a great deal of trust in the news. I'll stick some links in the chat when I'm done talking about some ways that we're trying to approach that. And Peter will talk a little bit about that today. But basically, the good news for us and what we really are here to focus on today is that trust in local news is higher for sure. People's relationship with local news is different than it is with sort of the media overall. We spend a lot of time talking about what people mean when they say the media, and what we can do as local journalists to tell a better story and to sort of differentiate our ethics and integrity and purpose and goals from that larger climate. Local journalists are more likely to be perceived like just sort of personally as, good people, having ethics, that sort of thing. We are part of this thing called the media. It's easy to sort of feel sort of superior to it and think people should know automatically that that's not us, that's those other people. But, every complaint that you hear from somebody in your community about journalism or about the media, you could find an example of where it's true. And so what we talk about is really getting clear with ourselves that plenty of irresponsible things are done in the name of journalism, and that our goal is not to defend all of journalism. Our goal is to not expect automatic credit for being the good guys in journalism, for being responsible, to remember that we ourselves value skepticism, that like not automatically trusting information, like that's a positive trait. We should encourage that, and we should kind of validate the skepticism and figure out how to guide people through making smarter news decisions. We don't try to defend the whole industry. We instead think about what is it about our work that sets us apart? What is our, is our ethics policy online? Do we talk about how we make decisions? Do we talk about how we decide what to cover? Who's on our staff? What we're careful to do? What sets us apart? One thing I'd really like you to think about as we talk about trust today is that there are some people who won't trust you. And that we really think of trust as a pretty wide spectrum between, the champions for journalism and the people who think that everything you do is probably just invented or made up or designed to manipulate them. Wide spectrum. So we kind of set aside the people who are unpersuadable. Maybe we'll get to them someday. For now, we know that it is a really confusing time to be a news consumer, that people's feeds and inboxes are full of conflicting messages of really varying levels of responsibility when it comes to sharing information, really different motivations behind the messages. And so focusing on recognizing that it's confusing and that most people could use some guidance as they figure out what their news diet should be. And most people actually don't pay all that much attention to the news. I think it's easy to think that our audience are all news junkies like us, but really having some empathy for that experience is really important. One more bit of research. There's this notion in trust research about comparing cognitive trust and effective trust that I find really useful. Cognitive trust is about the facts, sort of the proof of what makes things trustworthy. And journalists are all about facts. So we tend to feel really, really comfortable with this. The idea that I'm going to make a bullet point list for you of what makes my work credible. And when you get to the bottom of that list, you will therefore trust me because I will have made a good case. In some cases, that's true. Like explaining why this source is credible can enhance the perceptions of credibility. But effective trust is just as important. And that is the feeling of connection. That is the idea that people can trust our motivations and goals, that we have things in common, that we that we have their best interests at heart, that we have integrity. Those are things that it's hard to bullet point your way through. And it's important to keep in mind that not everybody has an affinity for us. Lots of people don't know us. Many people, 79% of US adults, according to Pew, have never talked to a local journalist. That might be higher in some of your communities, but in general, we know that the numbers are low. And people are less likely to have talked to a journalist the less white, rich, old, and educated they are. The less those things are true, the less time people have actually spent, the less likely it is that people in your community have ever talked to a journalist. So one last thing before I kick it over to Crystal, the research into why people say they feel misunderstood by journalism is really interesting. So many people just feel like the news is not made for or by people like them. And the reason behind that is different depending on who you're talking to. So this Pew research shows that, that white US adults often feel that their political views separate them from journalism, that their political views are not understood by journalists. Whereas people of color, Black and Hispanics are who's represented in this poll, feel like things about their personal interests or their personal characteristics, really just their race, are behind what makes them misunderstood by journalists. So I'm excited that you get to hear from Crystal today, that we all get to hear from Crystal about her own experiences as a journalist of color in a rural state and what she's trying to do now.
Okay. Oh, can you hear me now? Okay, great. I apologize. I was asking everyone if you would mind to pull out your phones, and I don't mind if you fiddle with them. I can't see you anyway. And please follow blackbygod.org. Sign up for my newsletter. That's step one to supporting communities of color that are trying to do journalism and outreach through this medium. Tell somebody else about Black by God. Tell me about a publication in your area or a journalist in your area that is reaching out to communities of color. This is the networks that we need to build and the infrastructure that is needed in this quote unquote new journalism. So blackbygod.org, sign up there. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram and all those great places. And you're going to learn a lot about West Virginia. And the first thing I want you to know about West Virginia is why the name Black by God. So folks, I can't see you, but I'm sure that you may be wondering why Black by God. In West Virginia, we have a way of differentiating. If you don't mind to go back to the other slide, if we have a way of differentiating ourselves from Virginia. Okay, so we like to say that we are West by God, Virginia, and where this lore came from, nobody really knows. Maybe it came at the beginning of the state. When someone was saying, we'll be West by God, Virginia. Some people say that it started at a WVU basketball game when the team was coming in and they had just won and a reporter yelled, it's West by God, Virginia. So when I was naming this publication, Black by God just settled really well in my spirit because it holds the identity of West Virginia, but it also recognizes the place, the history, and the future of Black West Virginians. So I'm proud to be Black by God, West Virginia. Okay, next slide. So I told you guys that I am a poet and a writer and a creative. And, you know, the most important thing in my work has been visibility. I have been very fortunate to be able to share my African-American Appalachian identity. And just that little funny word, Appalachian, often makes people just kind of giggle a little bit. But, you know, it really is important that we recognize that in rural places and all across America, Black people exist, Indigenous people exist, brown people exist, non-white people exist all across rural America. And I think sometimes we forget that even in the telling of our own stories. Okay, so my goal here is to just be a witness and to be a voice. So you guys have your own thoughts about West Virginia, what West Virginia looks like, I'm sure. But these are some of the images that keep popping up as I scroll through and read different commentary about my home state. But guess what? Next slide. I'm here to change that. And I'm here to change that through just presenting the reality that Black voices are missing from the region's narrative when it comes to talking about West Virginia. I'm sure so many of you are familiar with Hillbilly Elegy and the conversation around that. But what Hillbilly Elegy opened up was a dialogue that West Virginia and Appalachia is diverse and always has been. And so when I was creating Black by God, and I should also say that Black by God is my 16-year-old dream. When I was 16 years old, I tried to buy the last Black newspaper, the Beacon Digest. My dad was delivering them, and I was on my high school newspaper staff, and I just thought I could do a better job. And the deal didn't go through. At 16, I wasn't able to buy the newspaper, but they did offer me a chance to sell ads. And so fast forward, I'm 47 years old, and I am living in my 16-year-old dream, which is to run, operate, create, and develop a newspaper that would reach Black constituents across West Virginia. And there are 65,000 Black West Virginians, each in little pockets across the state of communities around 1,000 to 5,000 to 500 to 14, right? And so those are the areas that I'm concentrating on developing relationships in and brokering the message that, guess what? Black by God is here. And in that, and in that, I just want to share this one little statistic that in 35 years, the West Virginia Press Association has hired 3 Black reporters, and I'm one of them. So in 35 years of news coverage in West Virginia, there have only been 3 Black reporters or reporters of color in the state of West Virginia, which to me should be a shocking statistic, but I'm guessing that may be very familiar to the areas that you're representing. Okay, next slide. And so, the lack of BIPOC journalists and behind the scenes reporters is not a news flash. The Kerner report, which I'm sure some of you all are very familiar with, expressed this 50 years ago, right? And so this is not a problem that is unique to Appalachia. It is a problem all across America that we have a sincere and tragic loss of representation in journalism. And this is where we are today, accepting this, recognizing this, and taking steps to make a change. Next slide. So, for me, the hardest part is just saying, I'm here, right? Because Black voices are underrepresented all across the media in America. Appalachian voices are underrepresented all across the media. And if you haven't been following the news, then let me tell you that Joe Manchin, our senator from West Virginia, is making headlines every day. And so every day I'm reading commentary on what it's like to be a West Virginian. And I'm sure some of you all have these experiences too, when you're like, wait a minute, that's not it. And so in that, Black Appalachian voices are nearly non-existent. And they're nearly non-existent if you pay attention, just using the Joe Manchin narrative as an entry point. How many Black West Virginians are able to comment and give commentary on just what is going on in our communities? I'll tell you that the Washington Post did one story on Black voters in West Virginia, and outside of that, our voices have been non-existent. Okay, next slide. So here's a map, which I am really, really honored to be the dot on there now. They have an updated map, and they have put Black by God on there, but you can see the landscape of Black media across America, and you can see the absence of Black media across America. And so with some of the statistics that I'm sharing with you all, I hope that you will recognize, much like I do, that we are in a moment of transition. And here's the thing: as a person that grew up in a rural state, and understand a rural lifestyle, that I recognize, and it's also just kind of tickling to me that the majority of America is rural, and not everything happens in cities. And part of what we need to do is change that narrative, not only just in our television shows and our movies, right, but recognizing that the majority of America fits into this demographic. And I'm excited to be a voice out of West Virginia, a little tiny newspaper called Black by God, the West Virginian, and to connect with other newspapers and small independent folks across America to change this map. Okay, next slide. So, Black by God, this was the cover of our first issue. And I should say that I have been running the newsletter for a year. I've grown the membership from about 140, which was what I started with the newsletter, which was migrating a lot of my poetry and artist folks over to this newsletter, and have grown that from 140 to almost 1,000 now. With our last story that was pretty popular. It's still up on the website, about our governor, Jim Justice, and his pursuit to be a high school basketball coach while serving as governor. You can read that. But that story put me over about 1,000 subscribers. So I'm really proud of that in a year. And not only that, when I check the stats, people are staying engaged with the content. Not only are they reading it, but they're clicking links and they're sharing. And to me, that is potent. So I would rather have 1,000 engaged people than 10,000 folks that are just subscribed. And so part of my strategy with Black by God is to be consistent with the newsletter, which is what I'm developing, also developing a website so people can engage with the content there, and to do print. So there's the cover, and I did this print. It's about 40 pages in there, and distributed it across West Virginia, about 4,000 copies on Juneteenth. This was our Juneteenth issue. And what was so beautiful about doing the print was that it brought people into a tactile experience. So not only did teenagers that have never really touched a newspaper, and I know this, my son's a sports star, and the only time he touches a newspaper is when he's cutting out his own articles. But that teenagers would engage with the print because it was different and it was about them. There was people in there that they knew. All the way to grandmas that just, keep asking me, when's that next Black by God coming out? So the plan is to do a print 4 times a year. But this was our first and inaugural print, and I'm really, really proud of it. Not only did I learn a lot, which some of you may know about the print industry and just how expensive distribution is and all of those things, but what it did is it brought the community into a tactile experience where they could see themselves and engage with content much longer. So people had fun taking pictures of themselves with the newspaper or finding the newspaper, was able to put the newspaper in local businesses, in Black businesses. So what I learned also was that by doing the print, I could help drive people into a bakery or into Black-owned businesses where the newspaper was. And even though the newspaper is concentrating on elevating and representing Black voices and telling stories that are Black-centered, the newspaper also has a large support from white allies across West Virginia. And so it's a beautiful opportunity for people to learn not only about what's going on in their community, but to find those resources, which include Black businesses. Okay, so, that is blackbygod.org, and I hope that you will follow it. And as we move on through the day, I hopefully can answer some questions about what I'm doing, about what I plan to do, and how it's going and how it's not going. But the thing with this newspaper and the changing tide of journalism is that I'm really excited to be at this point to try things and to experiment. And one of the main things for me is to get into communities where Black people in West Virginia live and work, and to talk to folks. And so I've done a lot of focus groups, and am getting ready to launch another campaign to go into communities to talk to folks to see what they're interested in. The biggest piece of this is also, how can I build citizen journalists and folk reporters, is what I'm calling them, because so often I find that journalism and journalists have an interesting pedigree and have an interesting way of recognizing or segregating who can tell stories and who can't. And so my goal with Black by God is to empower everyone to tell a story, to tell their story, and to give them the tools that they'll be able to do that, whether that's through an Instagram storytelling, whether that's through an audio storytelling, whether that's through helping people understand how they can attend public meetings and take notes, and that those are valuable. So my goal with Black by God is really to think, how can we be creative in bringing as many voices in and allowing them to tell stories of their communities with less restrictions. And that doesn't mean that Black by God is trying to not do the facts and spell everything correctly and I'll follow all those rules. But it just means that there's a difference between equity and equality, and that when you're asking, which is what I'm doing, I'm asking a community to participate, that I'm not building an audience from a newspaper that exists. I'm not building an audience from any other place. This is brand new. I have to develop the audience from the ground up. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. So we want to, we wanted to kind of ask for a little, and we're running a little long on time though. So I'm just going to throw this question out to you for you to think of as we kind of go to our next session. Feel free, if you're in the chat, to answer this question with a couple words. But the idea is to think about what gets in the way of broader, deeper trust in your local journalism. Think about that. Think about what gets in the way of that. Then if you're there, yes, remotely, feel free to put that in the chat, that word or that theme that you think of. And then as you are here in person thinking about this, we're going to continue here talking about between trust and representation. And maybe for some of you, as you're thinking about what gets in the way of a broader, deeper journalism, maybe that representation is something that you think of. What's the diversity of your newsroom look like, right? And so when we think about representation in news, we're thinking about it on a lot of levels, but we're thinking about it from a storytelling standpoint, right? Whose stories are we telling? Whose stories are we not telling? Which voices are missing? Who does not feel seen or understood by your coverage, in your coverage? If you are including them in people in your stories, are we including them in a way that they feel that they are reflected, that their voice is reflected, their opinion is reflected? Some other things is, do people and voices missing from our stories trust us? That goes back to kind of how we were setting up this panel and this conversation, the session today. Do the people that we are missing, the people that we are not connected with, do we know if they trust us? Do we think they do? Or do we know that they absolutely don't? And if they don't, why is that? And could including them in the process or including their voice help? Do people and voices missing from our stories support us with their hard-earned money? And kind of something I think that for years and years in journalism and in the history, it's like, well, yes, of course they trust us and they should trust us, right? But I would kind of pose the question, like, should they trust us if they're not represented, if we're not talking to them, if we're not including them? Why would they trust us? And so part of this trust is a representation issue, and who are we talking to? So not only who's represented in newsrooms from that standpoint, but who are we including in our news coverage? And now I'm going to give it over to Peter, who is going to talk specifically about reaching conservatives as he participated in a recent research with Trusting News.
All right, so I wanted to call back to this slide that Joy shared a little bit earlier. And this partisan trust gap is something that those of us involved in Trusting News and I think some of my colleagues and I talked about kind of privately behind the scenes, like how do we go about addressing this, and do we even want to? I think there's a temptation to just not listen to our loudest critics, or to when someone comes to you with criticism that says, we don't trust you. Well, you should. We're credible. We're just presenting. Well, you're biased, and we get defensive and say, no, we're not. And the conversation sort of ends there. And that's not really addressing or investigating the roots of this problem. So at the beginning of this year, the Center for Media Engagement at the University of Texas, in partnership with Trusting News, sent out an invitation to newsrooms around the country asking who wants to actually try to study this and get a handle on what are the reasons for that deficit in trust. So I immediately raised my hand and said, I want to get involved in this because this is a conversation that we're not having. We hear all the time, especially from people on the right, that they don't trust us, that we are biased, we have a liberal agenda. And I don't think that at our publication, and at publications like ours, I don't think that we want to be a news publication for just one part of the audience, whether that's by race and ethnicity or by political orientation. There are news outlets out there that have had great success. Look at cable news, and there are news outlets that have made a great business out of appealing to only one segment of the market. I don't think at a local news organization that's something that we want to do. Even so, I encountered a little bit of resistance from my colleagues when I proposed taking part in this research. There were people that said, like, these are the people that hate us the most. Why should we even listen to them? These are the people that tell us, that I hear from them every day, that the election was stolen and we're not covering that, and they don't have a handle on facts. We shouldn't even bother talking to them. This also came at a time when we were undergoing a concerted effort to reach out to communities of color that were not seeing themselves represented in our newspaper. And so the question was asked, like, well, how is this? We're reaching out to this one audience, and now we're reaching out to this other segment of the audience, and those goals seem to be really opposed, and how is that going to fit together? I think at the end, I can make the case that that those two kinds of outreach have a lot of overlap and have a lot of the same reasons behind them. So the way that this research worked was a survey. So first of all, we invited through social posts, through a story in our paper and our website, and I did an appearance on a local talk radio program that appeals mostly to conservative audiences, and invited conservative or right-leaning members of our audience to take part in this survey. We had somewhere between 100 to 200 survey respondents, and we asked them, what kind of adjectives would you use to describe the local media, the national media? So to kind of get a handle on what are people's perceptions. Tell us what news outlets you find trustworthy and what news outlets you don't find trustworthy. And then I think the most important and interesting question was this question of, what do you wish journalists knew about people with your political beliefs? And so I sent out invitations to a bunch of people to take part in an hour-long interview. I had 5 people accept that invitation, and it was very interesting. I felt that it was very worthwhile, and I think that the people who took part in it felt that it was very worthwhile. The people who I spoke to were very thoughtful in their criticism. There was not a lot of anger and vitriol. These were people who read the newspaper and have thought a lot about these issues of trust. They were very curious. They had a lot of questions. There were a lot of things about our processes and how we work that they didn't understand. my kind of summary of what I heard from these 5 interviews, no matter how much I tried to focus the conversation on the local content that we produce, the conversation always circled back to the wire services that we use for national news, which is an interesting thing to hear. So we have, say, 30 people in our newsroom, and 2 or 3 of them every day are working on publishing wire content. The rest of us are in the community covering our local news, our towns, our local government, sports, arts, businesses. And so it feels like in our newsroom that national wire content is a really small part of what we do. But when it comes to criticism, it was an outsized part of what we heard, what the feedback that we heard. They asked us, like, who are the people that choose these wire stories? Why are you choosing them? Why does it seem like the Associated Press and the Washington Post treat politicians of different parties differently? They seem to be way more critical of elected officials from the right side than they are from the left side. Also heard a lot of either didn't understand or didn't believe that there was a separation between opinion and news. I explained to everybody that our editorial writer, our editorial board is completely separate from the newsroom. What they write doesn't have any impact on what we write. Some people had never heard that before. Some people had heard that, and they said, well, honestly, you've got an editorial writer who writes editorials and a column that are more or less leaning to the left. You have one staff news columnist who writes from a left-leaning position, usually in favor of Democrats and critical of Republicans. Why should we believe that that opinion doesn't permeate your entire newsroom? We also heard, just in general, either a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding about how newsrooms work at all. I was asked by most people, who chooses the stories that you write? There was the perception that we have an owner or a boss who is coming every day telling the reporters what to write. And a lot of the reporters who I told that to were like, well, that doesn't make sense. Like, I've never worked in a newsroom where every day someone tells me this is what you have to write. Like, we have a news meeting every Monday morning where all the reporters come in and say, this is what I'm working on this week. So Joy mentioned that 70-something% people have never talked to a journalist. I would guess that the number who's never talked to a newsroom managing editor is way higher than that. So if you've never sat in on a news meeting, never met a managing editor in a newsroom, like, you probably are imagining J. Jonah Jameson from Spider-Man movies, banging on the desk saying, like, get me pictures of Spider-Man that are going to show he's a criminal. I've never worked for a news editor that has banged on the desk and told me what to do. But that's kind of, I think if you work in a regular blue collar job, like, you go to work every day, your boss tells you what to do. I don't think that's an unfair perception. So I submitted my 5 interviews to the Center for Media Engagement. They collected from 27 participating newsrooms, I think 100 or so interviews, and the overall trends that they saw. So like we saw at the day, no matter how we try to separate ourselves from the media or the national news, perceptions of national news really affect people's perceptions of what's going on locally, either because of choices that we make about what to include or just sort of being all thrown in the same pot together. Another thing we heard is that the only time that I see conservatives in the news, you're showing me the farthest right, most extreme, narrow stereotype of a conservative. The racist, white supremacist, anti-gay, rioting Trump supporter. All 5 of the people who I spoke to, conservatives from the state of Connecticut, said, the ideals that define me as a conservative are not the ideals that Donald Trump is out there promoting. And it's really frustrating to feel like I'm being lumped in with this group. And also that there is a perception of bias, not just that journalists are going out with a specific agenda saying, I'm going to try to make Donald Trump look bad or make Joe Biden look good, but that there is an intrinsic bias there, and they see it in the questions that are asked or the types of stories that are chosen. So the Center for Media Engagement came out with 6 recommendations for what journalists could do to try to build trust with right-leaning audience. So these first 2, build relationships with conservatives in your community and listen to them. Include a variety of voices in your stories from people with conservative views. So both of those, I think if we delete conservative out of those sentences and replace that with some other group, people of color, gay and transgender people, millennials, people from rural communities, I would argue that these are standards that we as journalists think are important. And we probably ought to think more carefully about not stereotyping and reaching out to a wide group of people. I'm going to skip number 3 for a second. Focus on facts and not interpretation. Correct mistakes promptly to demonstrate trustworthiness. Don't criticize only one side of an issue. I think that I look at those and say, those are all things that we do. So if we are getting criticism for not doing these things, do we need to look more closely at our processes? I think that the issue of corrections is an interesting one. How many places really put the corrections at the top of their stories, or is your correction buried on page 3A? So these are things that I hear one-on-one feedback. One thing that I always do is ask for specific examples, because can we tease out, like, is this just an overall perception? Are these talking points that you've heard before? Or have you seen a story that the new facts came to light and we did not clearly correct that or reframe the issue? So if we are doing that, are we making sure that we are letting people know that we're doing that? This one, number 3, I think is probably the most difficult and maybe the most controversial. Consider diversity of political beliefs and backgrounds when hiring for the newsroom. So I bring that up to my colleagues and everybody says, whoa, like, we're not going to ask people, what's your political party? Like, who did you vote for? I can't ever see doing that in the hiring process. And so I was actually pretty resistant to this point. So Trusting News has been hosting a bunch of conversations online about some of the topics that have come up in this research. And one of the most recent ones was about bias/intellectual diversity in the newsroom. And I think a better way to frame that is not saying, like, let's go out and make sure that we're hiring conservatives, because I don't see a time when we're going to have some sort of political test and make sure that people are checking boxes when we hire for the newsroom. But I mean, the same way I think a lot of newsrooms have looked at diversity of race and ethnicity in their newsrooms, it's maybe worth thinking about intellectual diversity and diversity of opinion and background. The worry that I hear from my colleagues is, are we going to, like, we've always tried to hire people based on their skills and credentials for their jobs. And anything that we're going to put above that and maybe take people who are less qualified is a worry. But if the systems that give us the most qualified people for the jobs and are giving people those skills have only been traditionally serving people of a certain means, people of a certain privilege, maybe we need to take a different look about who we're bringing into the newsroom. And so not ask necessarily, what are your political leanings, but to look around your newsroom and say, I mean, how many of us don't have a 4-year degree? How many of us grew up in a rural area or an urban area? How many people in your newsroom are active participants in a religion or a faith? How many people in your newsroom have a military background? We have a huge military community that we cover, the Naval Submarine Base, the submarine manufacturer, and the U.S. Coast Guard. We've had a military beat reporter for a long time. The last 3 military beat reporters I've worked with did not have a personal background in the military. So if everybody in your newsroom is sort of from this homogenous background, I think that is going to make it difficult to form some of the connections that we want to form in our community. So really quickly, some of the things that we're doing at the Day right now. So to try to better address the issue of the separation between news and opinion is just putting better labels on our content. So if you come across, if you share one of our news columnists' opinion columns on Facebook, there's no indication that that's an opinion versus news. Like if you land on that page and you see at the top of the page that it says column, hopefully you understand what a column means. And if you read all the way to the bottom in italics, it says, this is the opinion of David Collins. We are changing that so that it says at the very top, opinion. You click on that, it's going to take you to like a glossary of terms that explains to you what a column is, what a letter to the editor is, what an editorial is, and why we include this and how it's different from news. We are taking some of this feedback about wire stories and thinking a little bit more critically, not just taking a story and saying, hey, it's from the AP, it's great, let's run it, but to look at the language that's being used and would we run that story without an edit or a rewrite if one of our reporters wrote it? And we're finding that sometimes the answer is no. And so we've opened up a dialogue with the Associated Press that hopefully is going to lead to maybe some changes in labeling or linking out to the AP's policies and giving a little bit more information about who the reporters are at the wire services. And that is just in general, more outreach, like not sitting in our siloed newsroom. The last thing that we did was a live chat on Facebook, text and video chat, just answering people's questions. And I feel like the more outreach we can do in different ways, just to have these conversations with people, the better.
Thank you so much, Peter. Next, we're going to go to Crystal, who is remote. So Crystal is going to talk about reaching out to communities of color.
Hi, thanks. So Black by God, goal is to center Black voices, which is a really different approach to journalism. And just want to, sort of echo what Peter was saying, but also wanted to add my perspective to it. And that is that if we start to fill in that blank and see conservatives as a marginalized group, that's a very slippery slope. So the work that I'm doing in West Virginia, which is a red state, is not trying to necessarily court conservatives to be a part of our dialogue. There's a very thin line there, I think, when you're talking about Black-centered journalism and what that means. And so I would encourage all of you, as you're doing your outreach and thinking about the challenge of conservatives versus liberals, to really try to center extremely marginalized communities in that narrative and to hear how they think and feel. Because what we have to start to do is unpack the data and start to recognize who we're talking to and who we're gathering this information from. And one of the ways that I feel you can do that is on who can help tell those stories, right? So who can help tell those stories is really just asking, who are you talking to? Who is a part of your community? Let's see, I'm just trying to see. So one of the things that is really important is to do a self-assessment, right? Decide how you define community of color, right? It's a big word. It has a lot of moving, changeable parts, but decide for yourself in your newsroom how you're defining communities of colors, recognize what is recognize the people that are in your community or are a part of the history of your community. What does your organization What is your organizational reporting when it comes to communities of color? Because what I find so often in West Virginia, and I just have to be very frank with you all, some of the most challenging people are well-meaning white journalists that think that they got it right? And that their perspective and that their voice is accurate and correct because they're not the other side, right? Because they're not on a very conservative leaning perspective. And this is some of the most challenging ideologies for me and other people to work within to express what's really going on. You've all heard words, microaggressions, all of that stuff. But often I find that reporters that write stories about Black communities feel that that's the check mark. And let me tell you what that is quite often. It is people going in and looking into a community and then going back into their own lives with not any investment. So I'm encouraging all of you all to take inventory of the stories that you are telling and how you're telling them. And then also, I know that in many places you may say, well, we don't have any diversity. We don't have any people of color. We have all these obstacles, blah, 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 blah. Well, you know what? That's an opportunity to start to address some of the broader issues that speak to racism and white supremacy in this country. Everybody has an opportunity to evaluate how you're telling stories about the police, how you're doing police reporting, and there's plenty of information out there to help trigger your thinking and evaluate what opportunities and what stories speak to the broader challenges for Black and brown communities in America. One of the things that I mentioned before that we're doing is, excuse me, I'm just trying to keep up with these slides here. Next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah. So when you're doing these self-assessments, one of the things that you can do is start with the history of your community. You will be surprised, right? Because if you know history, right, not everything makes it into the school textbook. Not everything about your community has been documented or an article written about it. And if it has, I bet you there's some more layers there. We're missing significant parts of our history. And I would challenge you to go look for it in your communities and to start to tell those stories. Also, it's really important to know where communities of color receive their news and information. As I mentioned with Black by God, I am not pulling an audience from the Charleston Gazette or the Huntington newspaper or any of the big papers, the big dailies, right? I am trying to navigate technology where people are finding their news on Twitter or through different outlets. And that's where I found through my research that communities of colors are not in the mainstream news, that they're getting their news from different sources, and being able to tap into that and evaluate the formats and the content that people are interested in. The other thing is why. Do you know why this outreach matters to your organization and you, right? There's a difference in the organization, and then there's a difference in yourself, right? And so why is this important to you? Why do you think it's important to court, to tell stories, to engage communities of color? You don't have to put that in your Twitter bio. You don't have to write an essay about it or an op-ed, but it's something that you should sit with and be honest with about, with yourself about. Next slide. Yeah. Okay, so here's a little self-assessment that I would challenge you to do for yourselves and for your newsrooms. How many, and this is true inventory, real data here, like get out the articles and look them up and make a little chart. How many stories have you written or your organization written about BIPOC subjects or interviews? So quite often I find that there are stories that people write about the Black community, right? But then when I read 100 other stories from a news publication, I can't find one person of color that they've interviewed. People tend to only go to seek a Black voice for an interview when the story is quite often about a Black community or something impacting, right? You have a huge opportunity to diversify your sources. And I think the main way that you can understand why that's important is when you really start to look at the content and really start to look at your subjects and interviews. How many stories are headlined for the Black community? That's a pretty easy lift, but just take an inventory. How many BIPOC reporters in your organization, in your community, in your state? I know the stats for West Virginia, and I think that's a starting point. And for many of you that are working off of nonprofit newsrooms and different spaces like that, the world is changing and funding is opening up. And I think that there's an opportunity here for folks to start to reach out and make this a priority. But first, you got to know how many folks exist there. Here's a big one. How many BIPOC editors in your community? How many BIPOC folks are sitting on those editorial boards? I know in West Virginia, in the history of West Virginia, I don't know if there has ever been a person of color on any newsroom editorial board. How many photographers are in your community? And quite often I find the answer to this is zero. People don't even think about all of the ancillary, right, jobs and opportunities that exist. People are always looking for the reporter, but there's so many behind the scenes spaces that I think can be inventoried and outreach can be made. So I hope that these ideas encourage you and give you some place to start. Really quickly, I'll also add that how many subscribers, right? And also when you're doing these polls and data, right? Being aware of, how many folks are actually contributing to the narrative. So I'm always very cautious and skeptical when people speak of, oh, this is what the community says, because I know that inside that they may have 0 to no contributors for the poll, simply because your poll is not reaching through a Facebook audience or an email audience that has any people of color on the other side. How many letters of the editors and opinion pieces are you getting from BIPOC readers? How many comments, engagements by people that identify as Black, as BIPOC readers? How many followers do you have and subscribers? How many podcasts or content creators in your community and non-traditional journalists do you even know? And how many BIPOC youth reporters are at your high school newspapers? And folks, this is where I think that everybody listening can start to think about how can we start to invest in high school journalists and high school journalism and different programs and projects, or a camp or a one-day experience with your newspaper that would start to build that pipeline. And that's all on that slide. All right, so my challenge to you all is to just do something. Just do something. Do something today. And the something that you did today was subscribe to my newsletter. And wow, boy, did you. I don't even know how many people are sitting in this audience, but I got a lot of subscriptions. And I just want to thank you. So, take that as you're doing something today to support Black journalism in America, but also do something to build connections, to reach out, to find new partners, and to just be vulnerable in what we know and what we don't know, and that we're going to make some mistakes. So staffing matters. You guys know that. Intellectual diversity, as Peter mentioned, matters. And that also includes, you could have a whole room full of people that look like each other, that look different, but maybe they just think alike, right? And that is to change your diversity of perspective, diversity of race, ethnic, gender, class, sexual orientation. You all know that. And just recognizing who is in your newsrooms, but more so who is not in your newsroom.
Thanks, Crystal. We're going to talk a little bit here about staffing matters, and I'm actually going to toss it back to Crystal here after a couple slides. Before then, we hear from Joy and Peter talking about connecting trust to money. So as Peter had discussed, and as Crystal just mentioned, with staffing, it goes a lot beyond when we're thinking about this diversity and who's included in our newsrooms, right? When we're thinking about reaching more audiences, who's in the newsroom making those decisions is going to make a difference, and it's going to impact what those decisions are. Thank you, Crystal, for talking about intellectual diversity, diversity of perspective, things about where people are from, how they grew up, different things that they might be involved in, right? Can we ask those types of questions to try to find out more about who people are while we are hiring? And so some questions to think about related to that, how well does your newsroom culture also, so if you have people in your newsroom that that have these different perspectives. We all do. The way we were raised, the things that we have done have all contributed to how we think about different subjects, how we're going to think about and cover a story or different individuals. So if we have different people in the newsroom, then how likely are people to speak up when they want to say, hey, I actually don't know that that's going to be perceived well by people who may have grown up this way or from people who are from my community. Sometimes it comes down to even word choice. There are certain words that just certain communities have different meanings for, or there's different connotation associated with it. And so are we creating a culture where people feel comfortable raising that hand and saying, hey, can we pause for a moment to just talk about how this angle covering the story may actually be perceived by different people in our community? Or, hey, you're kind of, I've actually been in a newsroom where I've done this as a millennial. Now it's Gen Z that this happens to as millennials get older, but all the headlines, millennials this, millennials that. And I'm the only millennial in the room at the news manager meeting. And I'm like, hey, wait a second, just so you know, I'm a millennial. I'm sitting right here and all you're doing is saying terrible things about us. Like, I'm one of those people. And let's think about that coverage and what we're perceiving. And so do we create a culture that's acceptable? And, millennial, whether it's where you come from, it's what your beliefs are, maybe it's your race, it's your ethnicity, religion, all of these things. Do we create a culture where it is people are comfortable raising that hand and saying, let's pause for a moment? And so those are the things that we think when it comes to creating more diversity in our coverage, it does matter who is on staff and is there a comfort level in being able to have those conversations. And Crystal, I'm going to pass it to you quickly to talk a little bit here about beyond your staff, how you can help tell those community stories and who can help that in the community.
So I think this is where quite often my background as an activist, as a creative comes in, because I think very non-traditionally. And so beyond your staff who can help you tell stories, I've just pop over to the next slide there. I think we've got things may be a little out of order for me, but there we go. So one of the things is, is just recognizing I come from a storytelling background, right? Just by culture, right? Just by nature of being Appalachian and being a Black American, storytelling is a part of the culture. And, that doesn't always lend itself to formality. It lends itself to word of mouth. And so if the next slide, please, the thing that I'm building is the Folk Reporters program. And I see this in two ways: in the traditional sense of how can we train people to go in and listen to community meetings and take notes and share those. But then also, how can we just tap into folks' natural way of storytelling and passing information? And for a Black community anywhere in America, the church has always served as that role. And that is by necessity, right? So newspapers, and when we're talking about trusting and things like that, those tools haven't always been available to a Black community, especially Black communities in rural states and rural places. So building a core of citizen reporters, which I'm calling Folk Reporters, is essential. There's no other way I can build Black by God without engaging the people to tell their stories. Otherwise, it's the same thing of people coming into a community, even if those are Black-bodied people coming into a community to tell the stories. It's not accurate, it's not truthful, and it doesn't actually build goodwill or change. So folk reporters and thinking about how to do community journalists. Now, one of the examples of this is who can tell stories. Now, you can't see this and we won't be able to watch it, but there is a fella named Martise Washington in West Virginia, and he has a Facebook page, and it's called the Hood News. And what the Hood News does is anytime the police show up on the west side of Charleston, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood that has been disenfranchised 30 years ago by the interstate coming through, and a lot of political unrest, meaning, city dollars, not necessarily the community having to advocate for street lights and parks and things like that, when just across the river, the more predominantly white community is accessing funds. So what Martise Washington does with Hood News is he shows up. And when I mean he shows up, that means when the police, by example, are on his street, he sits there with a camera. And to me, this is some of the most accurate reporting because he doesn't leave. He doesn't come in, get the story. Hello, police officer, tell us what happened, and then go back to the newsroom. He sits there the entire time so we get the perspective, right? We get witness. Now, to me, this is innovation. This is journalism. This is community storytelling. And we get to witness with our own eyes what is happening. Okay. And so the other thing that I think what Hood News does, and we've mentioned before, is how are you covering the police in your community? And I'll just point you to the Washington Post and point you to other resources that, it's time that we re-examine our reliance on the long time held, trusted, true source, which is the police. And start to look around and get different perspectives about who those stories impact and how we're reporting on those. And I'll just close here by saying that some of the other voices that are really important to me in telling the stories, there's a wonderful publication coming out of West Virginia. It's called the Appalachian Oracle, which is led by a white woman. And she is telling the stories of rural West Virginians from her perspective, but we found an alliance. So between the Appalachian Oracle and what Black by God is doing, we are trying to find ways to collectively reach into our audiences and tell different stories together. So with that, I would encourage everyone to look around at who are the independent newsmakers, who has a newsletter, who has a podcast, who is doing something to tell stories, and work with them, amplify them, and really just, try to build alliances that are outside of maybe some of the go-to resources that we have, which is another mainstream publication, and look for someone that might have an audience of 50, 500, a smaller audience, and just build resources within that. So for me, it's the Hood News, it's the Appalachian Oracle, and then I'm very, very, very encouraged and inspired by a publication called Scallywag. And so with that, I'll pass.
For those of you who are joining us remotely, feel free to answer these questions in the chat if you would like. And then for those in person, we're just going to have you kind of think about a couple questions that you can hopefully maybe do this after this, take back to your newsroom with other colleagues, and maybe think about what voices are missing in your newsroom. If you really were to just have an hour-long conversation, maybe half-hour conversation, and just start brainstorming what voices are missing in your newsroom, maybe also broaden this in your coverage. Who is missing? What would those types of people, who are those people? What are those voices? And then also think about, if those voices are present in the newsroom, is there a culture where people feel comfortable speaking out, or would feel comfortable raising their hand during a pitch meeting, or reading an article and making a concern, or raising a concern, or wanting to have a conversation about word choice, or who was interviewed possibly. And if you feel that maybe you don't have that culture, how can we create that culture so that journalists do feel comfortable doing this? Are there certain things that we can do? So those are questions that we pose to you, and things that we're going to continue to work on at Trusting News as well. If you are interested in participating with us, we would love to have you join us. And so I'm going to toss it over to Joy and Peter. First, we're going to hear from Joy, talking about the connection between trust and sustainability.
So the question of how trust helps us stay in business is, I think, one we can't, that we need to spend some time just really sitting and talking about here. I have some research in the slide deck that we're going to share the slide deck with you. We'll put it in the chat afterward and figure out how to get it to those of you who are in person, because we don't have time to go too deep into the research today. But I do just want to share with you that people think local news is in pretty good shape financially, and that's not helpful to us, that they think we're doing better than we actually are. People think that the newspaper is important often to civic life in their community. They take pride in it, and they think people should pay for it, but most of them don't pay for it. We do know that only 1 in 5 people, according to recent Gallup and Knight Foundation polling, shows that 1 in 5 people actually pay for local news. We do also know, though, that there's some positive signs that explaining the finances behind news increases support for it, that if people understand more where money comes from, they are more willing to contribute money themselves. So what we do at Trusting News is really think about the story we're telling about our finances. So where on your website or in your print paper or on your social media or in your newsletters, anywhere you are talking to your audience, where can people figure out where your money comes from? What are your revenue streams? What money do you make from, printing? What money do you make from advertising? What money do you make from digital subscriptions or memberships or whatever your business model is? How have those revenue streams changed over the years? Have you explained to your audience that ad dollars are down because of XYZ factors? Do people know where you spend your money? Do they know why you charge for access? One thing I've found really inspiring is during the pandemic, watching editors figure out how to tell a compelling story about their money. This is Robin Tomlin, who works for McClatchy in North Carolina, had a really powerful series of tweets early in the pandemic saying our readership is up 300%, but declining ad revenue makes it impossible to keep this free. Here's why we have to charge you for it. There's just this sense that journalists are greedy for charging for the news, or that information should be free. And at Trusting News, we really talk about what's your counter narrative to that. I understand why people who can click on anything from a free outlet on Facebook think that information should be free. I get that. I have empathy for that. And are we on the record explaining why what we do costs money to produce is different or better than what other folks are giving, and why we have to charge money for it? So I think telling that story is important. And one way to tell it is if you do have a paywall and you see public complaints about people, from people who are challenging why they have to pay. We work with newsrooms on language to respond and say, here's the local staff we're supporting. Here's why this costs money. And just don't let those complaints go unchallenged, I guess. Make sure your counter narrative is there. So we have a resource here where just a Google Doc with a bunch of language that we've worked with newsrooms on around how to explain where your money comes from. And then the real insight here is what newsrooms do with that. So I'm happy to kick it back to Peter so you can hear what he and his colleagues have done at the day.
So one of the questions that I get a lot of the time is, okay, this Trusting News work is great, but is it making the paper any money? Like, are we increasing subscription revenue because of this? And for the most part, like, I can't answer that question, but I'm going to share a little story here where I can answer that question, and the answer to that question is yes. So Joy talked about telling the story of your financials. The Day has a really unique ownership structure. We are owned by a split interest trust. So all of our revenue gets reinvested back into the company or distributed to local charitable organizations through a foundation. So any longer than a couple sentences conversations I have with somebody about The Day, I end up asking them, like, do you know who owns The Day? And a lot of times people say no. So we have, a great About Us section on our website that tells this story. How many people go to the About Us section? Not many. So we are always now looking for opportunities. How can we share this story? Hosting an in-person event. We had a film premiere of a documentary that I created, and my publisher stood up there and introducing the film said, how many of you know who owns The Day? Well, this is who owns The Day, and this is how it works. So one thing that's important to do. Another thing that I've tried to do at The Day is in our newsroom, create and facilitate and foster a culture of responsiveness, but also of actively reaching out and developing relationships with our community. So the responsiveness thing is, it's sort of simple, like respond to emails. When someone asks a question on Facebook or in the comment section, like take the time to respond to that person and have a human personal conversation. But don't just wait for them. Like let's reach out. Let's be proactive about showing who we are. I don't think that especially readers of newspapers feel like they have a relationship with the reporters covering their community. And a lot of reporters are okay with that. Like they got into newspaper because they don't want to be in front of a television camera. They're sort of prefer to be just a name on a byline. So we're trying to tear down that wall. A couple things that we've done is on our staff bios pages, instead of just saying that Claire Brissett covers Norwich and she's worked at the Day for 20 years, we've rewritten these bios as like feature articles about the reporter. We did a social media push with these so that, like saying, here, we want you to know who the people are in your community covering your community. We've also added bio boxes, sort of personal statements at the bottoms of our stories, so that instead of just at the bottom of the story saying Sten Spinella is our government reporter, it actually says, I write about state and national issues with a focus on Southeastern Connecticut. I particularly enjoy reporting on voting rights and how political trends play out in our local area. What questions do you have for me? Here's how you can get in touch with me. So really trying to foster that relationship. Also trying to better explain how things work behind the scenes. So we now have a person in the position of audience engagement editor with a weekly column. So one of her most recent columns was like, who writes the headlines? This is how we write a headline. This is what makes a good headline. So trying to look for opportunities for people to better understand our process. It was a long road to doing this, and there was some resistance. Like, why am I going to take time out of my reporting to let people know who I am? But when the pandemic came around, all of a sudden, this sort of became a necessity. We were all sent home. Money from advertisers dried up. Everybody was sitting at home worrying, like, are we going to have layoffs? Are we going to have furloughs? And so one of the things that I asked my colleagues on the staff to do, and I led by example and did this myself, is record a video at home and say, like, hi, I'm Peter Huapi from the Day. Like, normally I would be out talking to high school baseball players right now about the start of their season, but instead, like, I'm sitting at home trying to find a way to report the news remotely. And we're all facing these struggles right now. And here's why we think what we do is important to the community. And right now, we really need your support. So we put out a series of, I think, 10 or 12 videos by different members of our staff, published them on our website, published them out on social. We also had a front page column from our publisher. If you want to go to the next one, saying, hey, we think that this is something that's really, the Day is an important part of our community, and we need your help right now. Here's how you can buy a subscription. Here's how you can make a one-time donation to us. And the results of this were overwhelming. So our subscriptions did go up a little bit, but through this donation campaign that we did, we raised $88,000 in just one-time donations from people. And a lot of these were small donations, $20, $50, $100. And the feedback that came with these was just so heartening. We're used to hearing, like, it's a great pastime to complain about your local newspaper. But we with all of these donations, or with a lot of them, we got comments from people about how important it was to our community. So I think that this was a great demonstration of saying, look everybody in our newsroom, doing this, making these personal connections, letting people know that there are people here, that we are not just the media or this institution called the Day, that we are people who live and work in your community. And we think, and we hope that you think this is something important to us, actually can have a financial benefit to the company.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Now we are going to hopefully have about 15 minutes for questions from all of you. I know people who are joining us remotely have been adding questions in the chat, and I'm going to start with one of those, but I want to encourage people here in person. If you have a question, be thinking of it. We're ready to come to you next. And also people in the chat, please feel free to keep adding questions to the chat. We will be hopefully able to answer 5-6 questions in the next kind of 15 minutes. The first question that was in the chat basically asked, in the concern was brought up that, this takes time. One, thinking about outreach, thinking very carefully about stories, adding trust elements. I think Peter kind of hinted at this a little bit, those explainers, right? That's additional time. So how do you make the time in a situation where you're already a very busy newsroom, you're already resource strapped, and so can't probably hire new people. That would probably be the ideal situation, but knowing that that probably isn't a possibility, how do we do this? And so, Peter, I'm going to pass to you since you are in a newsroom currently. How are you working to make time to, let's start with outreach and kind of thinking more about diversity and reaching more audiences?
So, I mean, first of all, I'm lucky to be in a position that has a lot of freedom and control and schedule. And I mean, I think the simple answer is convince people that this is important, and then you just make the time to do it. Having somebody in the newsroom, whether it's someone like me who's not a manager, or having someone who's a manager that can be an advocate and push people for doing this, I think that this is something that I make sure to talk about every so often at our morning news meetings. We have a committee that gets together to talk about issues like this and plan, and basically just to make sure it's not something that we're just talking about, but making concrete steps. And I think one of the best things for that has been our partnership with Trusting News, so that we have an ongoing Slack conversation, and we have a monthly half-hour call with Lynn where we actually sit down and like talk about what are some specific goals that we can make sure we're working towards achieving.
That's great. Crystal, I want to go to you, see if you have any tips for newsrooms that to kind of reach out to the community, anything that can be done in a way that maybe isn't, that can be worked into the news gathering process, or if there are groups that maybe might already exist that can be good places for them to start this process.
Sure. I think it's always folks looking for a quick fix, looking for a quick answer, right? I get a phone call all the time. Hey, Crystal, we're looking for a Black Republican that voted for, I think that this question is necessary, but it avoids the work that needs to be done. And that is building relationships in your community. It's not a one and done. And that takes time and that takes trust. So no, you just can't call the NAACP. No, you just can't call the Black councilman or whatever and just feel like that's a check mark. You have to find ways to integrate yourself into the community. And that includes not only by race, right, but socioeconomic. Black folks are diverse in terms it's not a monolithic community. And so my answer and suggestion there is, how can you participate? That's it. How can you participate? And then I think the doors will open and really try to rethink the quick fix, which is who can I call that can tell me something about something because I need to do this right now. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Crystal. Does anyone here in the audience have a question that yes, I'll go up to the back. Yeah, go ahead.
You were talking about bios of, your newsroom staff being more transparent, things like that. What if your newsroom staff only has one person? How do you diversify a real rule? For example, like a weekly newspaper that only has 1 to 3 warm bodies in it. Like, how do you bring more diversity into that?
Yes, thank you. So the question for those of us joining us remotely was, when it comes to thinking of who's in the newsroom, our staff, and the diversity of staff. What if your newsroom only has one person? What if you have 1 to 3 people? How do you build that diversity in a very small newsroom like that? And I think also reflect it publicly as part of that question as well. Peter, do you go ahead?
I mean, one thing that I can say is we don't hire very often. So we talk about increasing diversity through hiring. I don't know when the next position is going to come open. So one thing that we've done is created a community advisory board, and it invited people from some of those underrepresented communities to come and meet with us and be that voice of the community in our ear. That has led to some stories that I think that we wouldn't necessarily have covered before. So from our perspective, I think that's been helpful.
We've had other newsrooms who have started doing this as well, forming community advisory boards that can, help them weigh in on coverage. Sometimes it's very specific around maybe certain people that they are trying to reach, or it might be certain topics that might, like police coverage. What should police coverage look like? And they might bring together people specifically to talk about that. And there are different members of the community and voices that may not be reflected in the staff or of who's in that newsroom. One of the newsrooms in Cincinnati does this. And I think what they have found is because people are used to logging in remotely, that they actually get a lot of participation from people that maybe they wouldn't have before because it required them traveling to a meeting, leaving their home. And now they can log in remotely to a conversation, a phone call, a Zoom call. So that's something to think about too. It doesn't have to mean actually bringing people together. It can, but it can be remote. And with technology, can it be text message even where you're getting feedback from people that you've kind of brought those people together? And then I want us also to remember the great information that Crystal talked about how can you have contributors, right? That maybe aren't staff members, but that you can have them contribute to your news coverage, maybe, hopefully still have some editorial process and procedures there to make sure there is, accurate information being shared. But what does that look like to involve the community in that process? Any other questions here in the audience? Okay, yes, I see one other hand. Go ahead.
So I got a chance to talk to some of my New Mexico colleagues last night, and one of the things that came up for us was some of the damage done by undoing the damage done by parachute journalism, where people come in to cover stories. We're in an area, specifically the town that I know, is every few months probably we have a major news story, and there's only 1,600 people in our village, but we'll have, like this year, we've had Reuters, Wall Street Journal, we've had a whole number of, because we're a border town. So people are much less trusting because they've been burned. And so I guess my question is, number one, working on repairing those relationships, but number two, how to partner with those major news organizations to ensure that they're really getting the full picture. People get upset that they're coming in for a day, they talk to a couple people and they're out, and they really aren't getting a very clear view of everything that's happening.
Yeah, so the question was, how do you undo the damage of parachute journalism? And so the question stems from an area where this reporter is living, where it's a border town, a lot of AP coverage, Reuters coverage, but they don't always maybe do a fair or kind of accurate portrayal of what is going on, because they might talk to a couple people. We've all kind of seen it. And then they make a generalization based on those couple people they may speak with. And so how do you undo that damage that's been done when now you're the local reporter, you want to tell a more responsible story? How can you do that? Joy, I want to pass it to you if that's okay, because this hints on what you talked about when you talked about trusting news and just how you can tell the mission and value of your journalism.
Yeah, thank you. I would encourage you to be real frank with your community about this. I wonder if you could write something to your community dissecting some of the coverage and say, look, we know that you see all the flaws here. Here's what we see in this one story. Just be on the record about what the problem is. And I also wonder if you could write something to those national journalists. Maybe it's something you send them preemptively, or when you know somebody's in town, you say, here are things you typically get wrong. That to me feels like advocating for your community and for authentic, accurate stories about your community. And it also is that differentiation we talked about like how you set yourself apart and say, look, we see this, we are part of the media, but this is not us. And here's why we need your support. Here's the commitment we have. Here's what we will always double check. Here are the pitfalls and the national narrative that we are not going to fall into. Be on the record about it and really beat that drumbeat.
You have a relationship with any of those wire services? So I mean, like we're a member paper of the Associated Press. They have a standards editor. So we set up a call with the standards editor and said, these are the problems that we're hearing from people in our community. They were grateful to hear that. We'll see if changes actually get made, but the people in your community are not talking directly to the editors at a wire service. So you may be able to get that person's ear where they may not.
Thanks. So we're going to now, I asked each of all of us to come up with kind of our challenge for all of you. And so I'm going to kind of kick it off, and then I'm going to go to Peter, and then I'll go to Joy and Crystal. We have just 2 minutes, or a minute actually now. So very quickly, my challenge is based in just thinking about how are we as journalists contributing to the polarization? How does word choice, how do generalizations contribute to the current polarization that just exists here in this country? And it's not just politics, it's around health now, it's around education, it's around so many things. How are we thinking carefully to not contribute and to actually create content that helps foster constructive conversations?
My challenge would be to put your audience first. I think when we hear criticism, we tend to recoil or get defensive or say, I mean, I've been in journalism for 21 years. I know what I'm doing, and your criticism is wrong. But I mean, we are here for the audience. So to listen to them, to remember that what we are doing is for them. And if we are hearing from them that what you're doing is not reaching us or is not resonating with us, that we should talk about that.
And I'll say that, for me, my challenge to you is to consider who is your audience. Because for me, I can spin up a well-meaning, progressive white audience pretty quickly, but that doesn't help center the voices of Black West Virginians. So quite often when we think of audiences, we're dipping into the same pool of news readers and people that engage with media. And so my challenge to you is to develop that audience, to develop a new audience.
My challenge is to really dwell in the messy, hard stuff, dwell in the feedback you're getting, and identify what you most wish your community understood about your job, about your mission, about why you're there, and then figure out a way to be on the record with that information.
And then just really quickly, if you want to participate more in our work at Trusting News, we'd love for you to, we have a newsletter called Trust Tips. We encourage you to please follow that. That's where we announce free trainings, how to get involved in the Pluralism Network, which is some of the work that builds off the conservative work, but we're expanding that beyond into thinking about how to work with and reach more communities of color. And then also, please do, if you want to dig in a little deeper, we have a free online course through Pointer that we will plug. It's totally free, and it's our deepest dive ever into basically kind of everything that we've worked with newsrooms like The Day, Peter, and other journalists on. You can learn how to engage in the comment sections. You can learn how to talk about your values, your mission, and how to defend your work online and on social media. So thank you very much.
My deepest appreciation to Joy and Crystal, Lynn, and Peter for being with us today and inspiring us to be more transparent with our readers and to be more honest with ourselves about these issues of trust. Very much appreciated this. It was a wonderful kickoff to our event. We will be back here to start the next session at 2:15. You should all have maps and materials that were provided to you that will give you a little bit of a guide to the downtown, various restaurants, things of that nature if you're interested. There are a number that are pretty close by if you want to check those out. If people could be back around 2:10, we'd like to get started right at 2:15. And again, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you in a couple hours.